Thank you very much, Freek, and organizers of the conference. It's a real privilege to be here to talk about overcoming the housing crisis. Preparing this presentation, we had some email communication. I was thinking about the global financial crisis, but then Mark asked the question, do we have a housing crisis? What is a crisis? Yes, we're academics, Freek, so we like to make things complex, to think a bit deeper. But that made me think of what actually is a crisis. I remember I was invited to Brussels and Paris to meetings called La Crise du Logement, sorry for my French, but there was already a crisis far before we know the word global financial crisis of housing affordability. That's not what I'm going to deal with today. I will focus on these pictures. For sale, I know that by experience in 2008. Not being able to sell your house. And then you're part of a system, there's a government that can help you, but sometimes make things worse. So what I'm talking about is housing systems. It's the market, including responses of governments, including informal institutions, norms, values that people have. And I think in some parts of Europe, and we are in one of them, there is a system crisis, the turtle on his back. And we try to think about how to overcome this crisis. So I will elaborate with you on the global financial crisis, the consequences, and how we can make the turtle smile and walk again. What I will do is start with some figures to demonstrate that it is a mixed picture. And I tried to find some literature which evaluated the effects of the crisis. Then I will deal with the role of housing institutions in England and the Netherlands. It's based on the work I did with Kath Scanlon. It will be published in a special issue of the Journal for Housing and the Built Environment on the housing crisis. Then I will elaborate a bit on the home ownership dream. I finished my PhD on that almost 20 years ago, and I've done some work since then. And then finally, I try to draw some lessons. Lessons for policymakers as well as for researchers. I start with some figures, as I told you. I mean, this is about house price increases. I'm a scientist. I know this is not the only and the best indicator for the situation in the housing market. But I think it is an important one. If you look at this picture, it's interesting to see what's happening in South America, what's happening in Asia, in North America, in some parts of the world. House prices went down, but are doing better again. You see at the far right side of the picture, that's Europe. I think it is doing relatively bad compared to other parts of the world, if we look at the housing price. Here we see a picture of Europe. This demonstrates that it's a mixed picture. Some parts of Europe do better than others. We see at the left side Ireland and Spain, as we would expect. We see many Baltic states there when we look at the period 2008-2012. We see some Scandinavian countries on the right where prices are still going up. The picture is not only mixed, however, it is also dynamic. Look at the Baltic states, for example. They moved from one part of the picture to the other. That's really interesting. I do not have the explanation for that, but it means that there is a lot of dynamic going on, and some countries seem to recover better sooner than others. So the picture is mixed. That was also the conclusion of a big book on the crisis on the housing market. an evaluation by Barton and many others. It covered North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. There are some conclusions I would like to share with you because I think they are relevant in this conference. A very important lesson from this book was we had a bubble. It were not only the homeowners, the commercial investors speculating, but also governments were speculating on the housing market by tax policies, by land policies. Another interesting conclusion is that the most deregulated financial systems were in the worst position. And that countries who did relatively well were the countries who made adjustments, who learned from a previous crisis, like Hong Kong and Korea. And then finally, there are many more conclusions, but these are the ones I would like to take out. There are some lessons for making housing systems less vulnerable for bubbles. And that's full recourse. That means you cannot run away from your house leaving the debt behind. You're responsible for your own debt. Prepayment penalties for your mortgage and no mortgage deductibility. These are measures that make risks clear, do not take them away, and are meant to make systems more stable. This all is the conclusion of the book, at the cost of a lower home ownership rate and mobility. So, an in-between summary, we see some countries do better than others. Europe does relatively bad. Another, I think, quite optimistic conclusion is governments can learn. And then housing and financial markets. It should be. Markets are intertwined and they are complicated. It is important to understand how it works, how housing markets, mortgage markets and governments interact. How do institutions work? That will be the second part of my presentation. And then the conclusion was at the cost of home ownership. And then I would like to reflect a bit on how important is home ownership. But first, the institutions. The comparison between England and the Netherlands I did with Kathleen Scanlon. And as a point of departure, we had an institutional approach. Institutions are important parts of a housing systems. And by institutions, I mean official rules of the game, the formal institutions, the regulation, laws, formal agreements, but also the less formal agrees and the norms people live with, the values and enforced mechanisms of obligation. But first, the picture of the two countries, England and the Netherlands. In this picture you see there was the global financial crisis, which impacted on the housing market in England as well as in the Netherlands. On the left side you see the impact on housing transactions. On the left side, on the right side you see the impact on house prices. Both countries, both housing markets were hit by the crisis. Then a comparison of the two countries, of the housing markets. You see here the percentage of home ownership. A bit higher in England than in the Netherlands. You see the mortgages, the percentage of mortgaged homeowners, higher in the Netherlands than in the UK. Private renting is different. But there are also some institutional differences that are worth mentioning, in particular when you want to understand how systems work and how governments respond to the crisis. In the Netherlands there is a mortgage guarantee by the government, supported by the government, that provides a guarantee for the lender, so the lender can give you a higher loan at a lower interest rate, and also it includes a guarantee for the borrower that he can leave the home without a debt. Mortgage interest deduction is a big issue in the Netherlands, and the interest deduction in the Netherlands is very high at marginal tax rate, and we have a relatively high tax, so it is very important for the Dutch economy. And I think related to this mortgage interest deduction, the mortgage debt in the Netherlands is much higher than in the UK. Then we tried to analyze or to make an overview of what the governments did in response to the crisis. And I must tell you, this is a very, very brief summary of what we found, because governments did a lot since 2008. But I only have 20 minutes to make a summary for you, to see that in the first stage after the crisis, both governments used different instruments, but had the same idea to push the housing market to overcome the crisis, to provide subsidies, to relax regulations, just to overcome the system, to wait until it would recover. A second reaction in the UK was to help people to prevent eviction. That was not the case in the Netherlands because, and here we come across an informal institution, it is important to learn that in the UK you buy a house after you sold your former house. In the Netherlands, up to the crisis, it was quite normal to buy a house and then sell your old house. So the crisis coming meant that people bought a house before they sold the other one and ended up with two. That's expensive. And if you count on the interest deduction, there was a regulation that it's maximum 2 years. So that's very, very important for people, and the response of the Dutch government was to adjust mortgage interest deduction to help these people. So both countries tried to help the people in trouble, but they did it in a different way. But then we had a second phase of the crisis. It was summer 2011, and then it was decided this is not only a housing problem, it's a problem of the financial market, the financial system, and it is necessary to change the financial system to make more restrictions to the mortgage market. The government has a role in limiting the risks for the borrowers as well as the lenders. This was the same conclusion in both countries. So that meant that new regulations were introduced, which made it much more difficult to get a loan. So this regulation for the financial market really comes at a cost. It harms the housing market. In both countries, that was the second stage. And then in the Netherlands, there was a third stage. That was a system change. After adjusting the regulations for the mortgage market, also the mortgage interest deduction was adjusted, was limited, and had its own harmful effect on the market. On top of that, it's not about the owner-occupied market, but also the social housing sector was reformed, and a new levy, you can hear more on this conference about this, was put on housing associations, which really meant a next harmful effect on housing market, housing production in particular. So what we see is that housing markets and mortgage markets are intertwined. And in response to the crisis, the English government and the Dutch government initially had the same reaction. try to overcome as soon as possible. In the second stage, the financial system was adjusted with a harmful effect on the housing market. And then finally, because the Netherlands has more institutions that supported borrowing, having a mortgage, and buying as soon as possible, they also were adjusted. And then that ends up this whole reaction to the mortgage crisis in, I think, a more harmful effect for the Netherlands than in the UK. Talking about the owner-occupied market, I'm not talking about the rental market now. Then I come to my third part, home ownership. Is home ownership a European dream? As I told you, I finished my PhD in '95, and I concluded by then that home ownership was a dream in some countries in Europe, and other countries had a more tenure-neutral policy. Up to now, I think, but maybe someone can correct me here, I didn't find any country in Europe that did not encourage home ownership by the moment. So I think I see no objections. In most countries, home ownership is encouraged, and in some countries more than others, sold as a dream. I like pictures, but I think I have to make it quick. This is a picture of home ownership over Europe. Eastern Europe is most dark, highest percentage of home ownership. Northwestern Europe, light, there you have larger rental sectors. This is a picture demonstrating the rate of home ownership in different countries by income quartile. This picture demonstrates that in our countries you see the higher people's income, the higher the home ownership rate. And you see that in Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, also lower income groups are homeowners, whereas in other countries the lower income groups find the roof over the head. In the rental sector. This is a picture, it's not easy to read, but it's meant to demonstrate. On the left side you see Western Europe, on the east side you see Eastern Europe, on the right side you see Eastern Europe. And there was a clear trend all over Europe for increasing home ownership. The last decades there was a growth, and Europe knows more and more homeowners. The question then is, why do all these governments encourage home ownership? What is the reason? If you look at policy documents, you can find several reasons. I think a very good reason, I've been studying housing equity, is the reason that home ownership means encouraging people to build equity. I've been involved in a project in housing equity, and that demonstrates that having a own home, building equity in your house is a way of disciplining people, and people say, well, it is a very good way for me to save money in old age. A second reason is help people to achieve the preferred tenure, or help to achieve the dream. I think the preferred tenure is fine, nothing against home ownership, but don't sell it as a dream. In some policy documents you see home ownership is considered as a way to empower people. And then we come in a more risky area. I think researchers in many parts of the world have tried to analyze this. And I think there is very, very mixed evidence if it comes to the empowering effect of home ownership. The same is the increased involvement in neighborhoods. It is the same there. Much research is done on the effects of home ownership. Positive as well as negative outcomes are found. So the second part of arguments, the evidence, we as a research community know that it's not that easy, that you can make people homeowners and they are empowered and they are attached to the neighborhood and the city is sustainable and nice. It is not that easy. And I think one important reason behind the policies to encourage home ownership is just a way to reduce the involvement of government in housing policy. So the lessons I would like to draw from this home ownership dream thing is that more home ownership does not automatically make a better housing system. I think home ownership, full home ownership, is not a realistic solution. You can aim for it, and maybe Norway is close to it. But you see in many countries that although, despite they've been encouraging home ownership for decades and decades, that they do not get a higher percentage than 70%. Look at the US, the UK. And when we talk about home ownership as a superior tenure, we know as housing experts we have to be careful. There are strong beliefs, there is weak evidence, and I think we should build on evidence as researchers and not on beliefs. I will finalize, Freek, yes, with lessons from the crisis. I think an important lesson is housing is and will always be vulnerable for speculation by investors and governments. It is also important to draw the conclusions that some systems appeared more vulnerable than others. It's important to learn from that. It's important to know that there is interaction between formal and informal institutions. There are policies that encourage government, that encourage home ownership, sell it as a dream, and that made it grow in Europe the values of the sooner you buy, the better, and the more you borrow, the better. Storing money is a waste. So then I come to lessons for policy. I think it is an illusion to think that governments can prevent bubbles. Housing markets are open to global financial markets, and the role of the government in this is limited. But governments can learn and they can aim for more stable housing systems. They can start by not speculating on the real estate cycle. Be careful. They can prevent the financial market from over-speculation. And they can think further than just home ownership and think about rental markets, how to organize them, about alternative tenures. There is more than that. That needs to be regulated and that needs to be facilitated. So governments giving room for new initiatives. I know many are going on in Europe, and I think governments should support new initiatives that are growing in different places in Europe. And of course, we as researchers, we need to research the effects of new initiatives. We as researchers, we need to create a better understanding of housing systems. And it is a bit painful. There is not so much funding for housing, but there are so many questions to answer about the housing markets, about how they function now. What are the new economic dynamics? What are the new challenges for governance? And I think in this all, we should recognize that housing is not only the housing market. It is connected to welfare. It is connected to the economy, to urban development and sustainability. And finally, as a coordinator of the Working Group for Comparative Housing, I think it is important to do more comparative housing because so much interesting is going on. We can learn from each other and we need good research to be able to understand the conditions for mutual learning. Thank you very much.